A very good morning to one and all. Myself, Professor Chetan Gupta, Assistant Professor in SIRT College Bhopal, the SAGE Group, and today we are going to discuss about the subject that is a database management system. The subject code is CS502, and in this lecture we are going to cover a topic that is instance, schema, data independence, and the attributes. So first of all, we are going to discuss about what are the instance and schema. First of all, instance. Basically, the data stored in the database at a particular moment is called the instance of a database. The database schema defines the variable declaration in the table that belong to a particular database. The value of these variable at a moment of a time is called the instance of that database. For example, let's say we have a single table student in the database. Today, the table has 100 records. So today, the instance of a database has the 100 records. Let's say we are going to add another 100 record in the table by tomorrow. So the instance of the database tomorrow will have 200 records in the table. In short, a particular moment, the data stored in the database is called instance. That changes over a time when we add or delete the data from the database. So the definition satisfies that the data stored in the database at a particular moment is known as instance of a database. Now, second one is schema. Schema, basically the design of a database is called schema. The overall design of a database is known as schema. Schema of three types: physical schema, logical schema, and view schema. The physical schema is related with the physical structure that stored the information about how the data are actually stored in the database. Logical schema, it is stored the information is what data is to be stored. And the logical schema or view schema means overall structure of a database. The design of a database at physical level is called physical schema. How to data stored in the blocks of a storage is described at this level. Design of a database as logical level is called logical schema. Programmer and the database administrator work at this level. At this level, the data can be described as certain type of data record get stored in the data structure. However, the internal details such as implementation of data structure is hidden at this level. The third one, the design of a database at view level is called view schema. Generally, describe the end user interaction with the database system. The second topic is data independence. Basically, it is the ability to modify the data at one level without affecting the just next higher level is called data independence. There are two types of data independence: logical level independence and physical level independence. The logical is called external level, the physical is called internal level. Suppose we are going to change in the logical schema, so the physical schema will not affect. And if we are changing in the logical schema, so the physical schema will not change. Means the data independence is maintained during the physical changes or during the logical changes. That is simply known as data independence. The next topic is entity and entity set. Basically, entity in the database can be a real world object with an existence. Entity have attributes which can be considered as a property for describing it. Means each entity have their own attribute. Now, what is entity set? A set of entity of same type that shared a common property is known as entity set. For example, a student in a classroom. Basically, the entity is represented by a rectangular block. In DBMS, the entity is represented by a rectangular block. Means whenever you see a rectangular block, that basically indicate an entity. There are two types of entities in the data set: strong entity set and weak entity set. Strong entity set are those which having a primary key, and weak entity set which do not have the sufficient attribute to form a primary key. The representation, the graphical representation of a strong entity set is by the rectangular block, and the graphical representation of the weak entity set is done by the double rectangular block. Now, what is the difference between the strong entity set and weak entity set? The representation, we have seen that it is represented by a rectangle block and it is represented by the double rectangle block. This is the graphical differentiation between a strong entity set and weak entity set. But if we talk about in detail what is a strong entity set and what is weak entity set, so there is some difference. A strong entity set always have primary key, means the entity set that always have sufficient attribute to form a primary key is known as a strong entity set. The weak entity set, what is? It does not have attribute to build a primary key. The strong entity set, second point, it is represented by a rectangle symbol, or it is represented by the double rectangle symbol, as we have already seen in the previous slide. It contains a primary key that represent by the underline symbol, means what? The attribute which value is unique, which value is not null, considered as a primary key, and the primary key is represented by a single straight line. And the weak entity set, it contains a partial key which is represented by the dash line symbols. Strong entity set, fourth point, in ER diagram, the relationship between the two strong entities set is shown by the diamond symbol, if we talk about relationship. And in weak entity set, the relationship between one strong and one weak entity set is represented by double diamond symbol. Last point, the connect in a strong entity set, the connecting lines of a strong entity set with a relationship is single, and in weak entity set, the lines connecting the weak entity set for the identifier relationship is double. There are some symbolic notation for entity, relationship, and attribute. Remember, entity is a real world thing, and each entity have some sufficient set of attribute, and entity are related with each other with the help of relationship. Means if whenever we discuss about our ER diagram, that is the entity relationship diagram, so we will discuss about these and all the remaining representations of the symbols in detail. But in today we are going to discuss about only what is entity, what is relationship, and what is attribute. Basically, this is one of the example of ER diagram in which professor is written inside the rectangle block, that is means it is an entity, and department is also entity, but professor is a strong entity set and department is a weak entity set here in this example. And professor has some attribute like employee ID, employee name, department designation, and phone number. But the professor have employee ID, and employee ID is unique. That's why the professor, that is an entity, is considered as a strong entity set. But in department, we have some attribute like relation, birth date, gender, and name. But the department does not have any attribute which can we work like as a primary keys. That's why department is considered as a weak entity set. And the relationship between the professor and department is shown by the double diamond shape symbol, because always if there is a one is strong entity set and one is weak entity set, the relationship is always represented by a weak relationship, that is represented by the double rectangle. Now the next topic is an attribute. What is an attribute? Basically, any property of an entity set is known as attribute. Means whatever the property of an entity is known as attribute. In general, the attribute have some attribute is considered as a characteristics. There are 4 different types of attribute: simple and composite attribute, single and multi-valued attribute, null attribute, and derived attribute. So we will discuss one by one. First one, we are going to discuss about what is simple and composite attribute. An attribute which cannot be further subdivided into new component or into subcomponent is known as simple attribute. means the attribute which cannot be further subdivided is known as simple attribute, and the attribute which can be split into component known as composite attribute. For example, if we are taking a name can be considered as a composite attribute. Why? Because name can be divided into three things or three subparts: first name, middle name, and last name. But if we talk about first name, middle name, and last name, it cannot be further subdivided, so it is considered as a simple attribute. Means all these first name, middle name, and last name, this is considered as a simple attribute, and name is a composite attribute. Why? Because name can have be subdivided. Similarly, there is another example of address. So address can be considered as a composite attribute, because in address we can divide subcategories or sub attribute like street, city, state, and postal code. That's why address can be considered as a composite attribute, and your state and postal code can be considered as a simple composite simple attribute. The second attribute is single and multi-valued attribute. First one is single valued. The attribute which can take up only a single value from the entity instance is called a single valued attribute, and the attribute which take more than one single value for each entity instance is called multi-valued attribute. For example, student is an entity, and student have some attribute like roll number, date of birth, phone number, and mail ID. But the student have single date of birth, the student have unique roll number. So the attribute which are single valued like roll number and date of birth is called single valued attribute. But there is a chance that student have multiple mail IDs, student have multiple mobile numbers. That's why that phone number and email ID is represented by double ellipse that represent the multi-valued attribute. Means single valued attribute is represented by ellipse, single line ellipse, and multi-valued attribute is represented by double line ellipse. So that is the differentiation, graphical differentiation between the single valued attribute and multi-valued attribute. The next attribute is null attribute. The null attribute are those which are missing, not known, or not needed. This is called the null valued attribute. And the last one is derived attribute. Basically, the derived attribute is what? Which can be derived from the another attribute is known as derived attribute. For example, in rectangle block, there is a student, it is an entity, and a student has some attribute like roll number, gender, date of birth, and age. What we have seen that the age is represented by a dash line. So that is a derived attribute, because if we want to know the age of any student, and suppose we have a current date, suppose we know the current date, and we have a date of birth of that student, so we can easily calculate the age of any student or age of any person. That's why that means the age is derived from where? It is derived from the date of birth, and it is derived from the current date. So the attribute which can be derived from the existing attribute is known as derived attribute. So in today's lecture, we are discussing about what is instance, what is schema, what is entity set. There are two types of entity set, a strong and weak entity set. After that, we have discussed about our topic, that is your attributes, in which we have discussed four things: single valued attribute and composite attribute, single and multi-valued attribute, null valued attribute, and derived attribute. So in today's lecture, we are discussing some few topics. In next lecture, we are discussing about the few remaining topics of the DBMS. Thank you so much.